If there's one engine on the island of Sodor that the Thomas fandom seem to love unconditionally, it is James, the number 5 Red Engine. Words that have been used to describe this mixed traffic engine are confident, egotistical, self-important, insecure, cheeky, highfalutin, arrogant, cocky, boastful, prideful, shallow, naughty, and vain. Not exactly a glowing character reference for any employer to see, let alone one of Sir Topham Hatt's standing. Yet throughout every iteration of the franchise, James is widely regarded as one of, if not the, best character in Thomas and Friends. So much so, in fact, that when the Hit era went through their rebrand, James was moved up alongside Thomas and Percy in their marketing campaigns. Up until this point, James was more associated with Gordon and Henry, popular engines, but not quite front and centre as our number 1 and number 6 engines respectively. Yet somehow the tide turned, and now he is one of the main engines on every bit of promotional material, and his toys are hot sellers, even in the dreaded All Engines Go reboot. James's livery sets him apart from the others and onto international stardom. After all, a smart red engine like James is very unique. Yet other engines like Mike, Arthur, Victor, and even Rosie in the later CGI series never quite broke through this glass ceiling that James had managed to. Was it longevity, lore, personality, or a combination that endeared him to the fandom? But more importantly, why does everyone like this prick? We've already established that James has a lot going for him, but I just can't comprehend why everyone loves this petulant, spoiled man-baby whose only real traits are being a bigot to others, having a massive Napoleon complex, and quite frankly, causing more trouble than he's worth. Join me, your ginger engine, as I try to do what is already an impossible task. Convince the fandom that James the Red Engine is one of SODORS BAWBAGs. Before I get into it, I already know that this is an uphill battle. I have tried to put my point across on this before, and while I didn't receive as many death threats as I did with my Thomas as a Bawbag video, my reputation still took quite a hit in the fandom. But everyone is allowed an opinion, and my opinion is that I just don't see the appeal of this character. If you took all of the character traits that I mentioned earlier and wrapped them up in the package of a diesel, say a Class 40 or Old Stuck Up, I don't think the fandom would see James in such a positive light. And that is where I'm going to start with this video, his personality traits. James is a character that is not shy about his disdain for other engines, or anything that doesn't fit his social conventions. He sees the elderly, the diesels, rolling stock, the narrow gauge engines, and dirty objects as inferior to him because of his own insecurities around how he looks. I'll get to James's prejudices in the next section, but many people have said this is because of James's accident that he had on his very first day on the island of Sodor, when he was still in his original black livery, at least in Railway Series and Adventure Begins canon. James himself had a defect, wooden brake blocks, which caught fire when he was pulling a goods train. These trucks pushed him forward, and eventually he came off the line, resulting in a crash. Because of this accident, James got what he is now most associated with by the fandom, his red paint. And he's become so protective of it that even the slightest incident, no matter how small, sent him completely tonto. While what James went through was clearly a traumatic experience, there's only so many excuses that someone can make for their bad behaviour before it just starts to grow tiresome. Personal accountability is something that comes as a part of growing and maturing, and James does not show this, unless he suffers a major fall from grace. But even then, it never really lasts. In James and the Coaches, James wets Sir Topham Hatt's nice new top hat by getting a bit too excited and letting off steam. After being reprimanded the next day and being threatened to be repainted blue, he takes his temper out on the Coaches and bumps them so hard that their brakes have to be repaired with newspaper and the passenger's bootlace. It takes 2 more episodes for James to mend his relationship with the Fat Controller and for the other engines to think well of him again. But it is a good character arc that shows James can learn from his mistakes. But after this, he goes back to being the arrogant a-hole that we all know and supposedly love. And this is evident on multiple occasions. In Season 1, he joins the strike with the big engines, shows no sympathy for Henry's coal problem, and teases Toby and Henrietta for their appearance. In Season 2, he calls Edward slow and old iron, pushes both Percy and Duck around and Duck takes charge, contributes to Duck getting sent away in dirty work, and insults Edward's attempts at pulling a train in Edward's exploit. In season 3, he gives Toby a hard time in Time for Trouble, tricks Thomas and Gordon in No Joke for James, then ironically sides with Gordon to trick Thomas and trust Thomas, is a straight up racist to Boko and Buzz Buzz, and in Percy, James and the Fruitful Day, he acts like a complete bell end to Percy, which sparks all of the events that happen in that episode. In season 4, James encourages Duncan, one of the narrow gauge engines, to continue being a racist prick to Rusty, the diesel engine. And in season 5, he acts like a massive bell end in both James and the Trouble with Trees and Make Someone Happy, the latter of which causes Thomas to tell James to wind his funnel in. These are instants in just 5 seasons of Thomas and Friends, and there's hardly any character growth from him. Even the unlucky Tug touches on this in his Sodor's Finest video, whereas Thomas, as much as I hate to admit it, did mature over those seasons, to the point where he called James out for being a bawbag and Make Someone Happy. Thomas is an example of how a character can grow and mature from a past trauma in a positive way. James, however, is the example of if you don't deal with your trauma in a positive way, you turn into a complete bellend who suffers from Peter Pan syndrome, never growing and never changing. So let's dive into James's prejudices just a bit more. It's not something that I necessarily blame on the character himself. Well, I do, but it's because that's how he's been written, by poor writers. Robert Audrey may not have intended James to have been cast as the racist bigot of his series, but it was how he was interpreted. So much so that in Christopher's book, James and the Diesel Engine, he had to very quickly write it out of his character. Now you can say what you want about that, but at least Christopher tried to write it out in some way. The TV series instead doubled down on him hating everybody that wasn't in his image. Steam trams, diesels, older engines, rolling stock, pretty much everything really, James seen as beneath him. Why? It's good for lazy writing. As Thomas and Friends delve deeper into the territory of babies and toddlers, you needed a character who could be cast as a complete bigot so that in an episode they could be humbled for being a bigot and then supposedly learn and grow from this, only to turn back to type straight afterwards. And the only character that could fit this flanderized version at the time was James. Thomas was the cheeky one, Edward and Toby were the old ones, Henry was the frightened eco-warrior, Gordon the grumpy dad, Percy the baby, and Emily the token girl character. This also meant that any engine that was cast as racist jerk in any episode that wasn't James instantly got on from a great height, because the fandom would say that it was so out of character. But looking at you, Edward strikes out. When people are saying that you should replace Edward with James because he already has established prejudices, and then they say that that would make the episode better, that is not a good thing. It proves that there is a racism problem that runs deep within the character of James. Yet because James learns his lesson by the end of each episode, he's seen to be alright again. James's characteristics of racist to redeemed, then back to racist, give me emotional whiplash. Now, I was going to give James his due and say that he is portrayed as a lot of things, but one of them is not a sexist, because he doesn't seem to really have any issue with female characters in the franchise, until I saw the season 21 episode, The Fastest Engine on Sodor. For the normies to the channel, let me break this down. James is once again boasting about how he is the fastest red engine on Sodor, until Thomas tells him that Rosie is now red. This ignites James's inferiority complex, and he challenges Rosie to a race to see who is the fastest red engine on Sodor, during which he almost crashes into Henry. Rosie advises him to go and get his brakes checked, but on his way to the steamworks he decides against it. And while he's racing down Gordon's Hill, he runs out of brake fluid and crashes full speed into Tidmouth Sheds. It's quite an intense crash, and it's the result of James not being able to accept the fact that a red female tank engine could be faster than him. So nice job, every writer on Thomas and Friends who turned James into a racist, ageist, sexist douche nozzle who has about as much sympathy for me as I would give to an avocado. You might think that I'm being overly harsh, and you're right, I am being overly harsh, but it's because it's affecting me on a personal level, in particular my own issues around my self-confidence. I'm not a confident person, and as a matter of fact, a lot of people in the UK aren't confident, because we had it drummed into our skulls that being confident was actually being seen as being egotistical and brash and cocky. But this minor side note does lead me into my next point. Most of James's personality traits, if you had to put them into a positive and negative column, would file into the negative column. Some audiences can't take to it, and some do, but they do so for the wrong reasons. A lot of the fandom at one time or another, and I'm including myself in this, secretly wanted to be like James. We weren't allowed to be confident in our normal life, so we would have loved to have been the overconfident, cocky little that James is. It was an escapism for us. We were pushed into a mold that ostracized us for being confident, so we live vicariously through James. He has self-importance, and we just long to feel important in our lives. But when you finally get to the point that you can accept yourself for who you are, and quite frankly not give a about what anybody else thinks, you take a step back and realise that James's traits are actually very unhealthy. At least in the way that he expresses them. He's confident, but only because it's a defense mechanism that he uses to push others away. He's cheeky, but his ego is so overinflated that it's become arrogance. He's self-important, but that's because James believes that no one thinks that he is important, especially to people that he admires like Gordon and Henry, who are bigger than him. He's highfalutin, but James has become so shallow and obsessed with his looks that he overcompensates with aggressive boasting. And finally, he's vain, but it leads to him becoming naughty and causing accidents on Sodor, and some of them are quite costly. So let's look at some of the accidents that have occurred as a result of James's vanity. He crashes into tar wagons and dirty objects, zooms off the tracks into snow and keeping up with James, crashes into a poster of Edward and James the second best, gets caught in a snowstorm and James works it out, flies into a muddy marsh and James to the rescue, doesn't wait for Rocky to be secured, which leads to Oliver crashing into James, who then knocks into Rocky, and thus knocks Duck back into the water, and Duck in the water, goes too fast, which causes Toad to uncouple, rolling downhill with a train of trucks, almost crashing into Thomas's train in Toad's Adventure, and I've already mentioned the season 21 episode The Fastest Red Engine on Sodor. Oh, and did I forget to mention he almost got himself and Percy killed in Tale of the Brave? If this was any other engine on Sodor that wasn't part of the established steam team, they would either be taken off duty or sent to the mainland. But because James is that demon stepchild that you think has some good and potential in them, he gets off with it. The CGI series, and in particular the Brenner era, was very guilty of playing into James's negative personality traits. In particular, the angry, pouty, stubborn, temper tantrum sides. As I said before, the Flanderization was very common, but with James they just went OTT with it, to the point that even the fandom at the time couldn't stand James as a character. And even the most die-hard Thomas fan will admit that James became such an annoying jackass from season 18 onwards, and they even found it hard to root for the guy. Yes, he was an ass in the Railway series. I know Unlucky Tug doesn't think so, but I do. And even the model era. But at least it was a consistent level of douchebaggery. Or at least enough that you could say, well, it's just James. But even though Andrew Brenner said that James was his favourite character, I personally think that he also thought James was a bawbag and used him as the vehicle to set up all these traits. James became an arrogant, selfish jerk who would learn his lesson and reset the following episode. The Brenner era really tried to strive for continuity, and with James, he did so, but it was for all the wrong reasons. There are some videos in the fandom that go into James's character and see him in a different light. For example, the channel Cosmic believes James has issues like anxiety and body dysmorphia, which causes his erratic behaviour. I'll put the link to that video in the description. As I said previously, the Unlucky Tug has done a full Sodor's Finest video on James, and once again, the link will be in the description. And it is worthwhile checking out these videos and coming up with your own conclusions on what you think James is like as a character. He is extremely popular, and I do understand why, because he's like an onion. The more you peel back the layers, the more you find out about. And it's fascinating to me that a throwaway character from the second book of the Railway series has sparked such a debate in our fandom. I think James represents the best and the worst of humanity. He's proud, yet boastful. He's fiery, yet impatient. He can be a really useful engine 1 minute and a ticking time bomb the next. And I do have my own theory of why James can act the way that he does, in particular around engines like Edward and Toby. This is quite a dark theory, so be prepared. I think James has a fear of death. James sees older engines as dirty, slow, old iron, pathetic, weak, impossible, and only worthy of either preservation or the cutter's torch. I think this is because James was very close to suffering a similar fate after his accident on his first day. A less forgiving controller could have looked at the error of James's brakes, wrote him off, and sent him to be scrapped. That controller didn't do that. But it's the closest thing to a near-death experience that James has had, and it terrified him. And if we peel back the layers of the onion that is James, it can explain all of his negative personality traits. James always has to be the best because he never wants to be seen as old and weak. He has to be the fastest engine on Sodor because being slow isn't useful. He has to be bright red because he doesn't want to fade away into obscurity. He wants everyone to know who he is because when you get old, people forget about you, and he doesn't want to fade away into nothingness. Look at engines like Neil, Proteus, Glenn, Stephen, Hero, and there was multitudes of unnamed engines from the Railway series. These were engines of a bygone era, who in some cases were lost to the sands of time. James wants to live for as long as he can and be remembered in any way, whether it's as a finest engine or a complete bawbag. If James was a human character in our current climate, I can guarantee he would be in regular therapy at least once a week, probably on some medium strength medication to try and tame the erratic and impulsive nature, and probably be having some CBT or anger management classes. I know this because this is what I get, and my fiery temper can be like James's. But I want to emphasize that just because I don't like James as a character doesn't mean that he is a bad character. Quite the opposite. He is what every writer longs for, a flawed protagonist that you can create stories around. It's why so many of the best stories do revolve around James. Lazy writers can take this character and turn chicken into chicken salad. A flawed protagonist polarizes your audience's opinion. I could easily see James being like the Tony Soprano of Thomas and Friends, because it makes him so much better than your bland, generic, cookie cutter characters that only appear in a couple of episodes of this franchise. If you like James, more power to you. I have nothing against it, but I personally don't like the character. I live my life surrounded by wannabe Jameses. And trust me, they are not the nicest people to be around in real life. I equate them to emotional vampires who suck the joy and life out of you because they have to be the center of attention. They have it 100 times worse than you, so you can't comprehend what they've went through. They are the real number one engine, despite the fact that they have a number 5 and are the equivalent of the number 2 that I flushed down the toilet. It hits me more now that I'm a dad myself, because I look at characters in TV shows and specifically their personality traits and think, do I want my sons having these characteristics? And when it comes to James, no, I don't want my sons to model this character. James is erratic. He's broken. He's traumatized. And if that's how my kids turn out, then I personally have failed as a dad, because my job is to make them healthy and happy. Something that really bothered me about the engine roll call was when they said that James was vain, but lots of fun. They got the vain part right, but from what I see, he's not fun. He is sad. And I want to go and give him a cuddle and tell him that it's all going to be okay. He doesn't need to be scared anymore. The trucks can't hurt him. He doesn't have wooden brake blocks anymore. He's not the fastest engine on Sodor, and that's okay. He doesn't need to be vain or boastful to get others to like him. He doesn't need to have red paint to stand out from a crowd. And while we're on his red paint, so what if there's a scratch on it? It's okay to be imperfect. James is imperfect in a multitude of ways. He's not bad, but when you look at it in the cold light of day, he is one of Sodor's Bawbags.